Welcome to Untaught Essentials. I'm Jeremy Hunter. We're taking a summer vacation, so this episode we're going to do something a little different. For those who know me, know all too well that food is an integral part of my life. So we're going to share an interview I did on the Japan Eats podcast with the renowned Japanese food authority, Akiko Katayama. Akiko is director of the New York Japanese Culinary Academy, author, columnist, and coolest of all, has served as a judge on the Food Network's Iron Chef Amaerica. In keeping with Untaught Essentials themes, we talk about the quality of attention, the flow state and how it relates to Japanese tea ceremony, and my legendary father-in-law. This comes to us courtesy of Heritage Radio Network. Check them out at heritageradionetwork.org and see the show notes to support their good work. If you have any interest in Japanese culture or Japanese food, you'll want to check out Japan Eats. It's an amazing treasury of resources. Thanks for listening, and I hope you're enjoying your summer.
Hello, welcome to Japan Eats. I'm your host, Akiko Katayama, food writer and director of the New York Japanese Culinary Academy, which promotes a deeper understanding of Japanese cuisine in America. We normally broadcast live from our studio at Roberta's in Bushwick, Brooklyn, but our studio is currently closed due to the coronavirus outbreak. So we are recording this episode remotely from my apartment in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. And I hope everyone is safe and well. So this show is all about Japanese food and food culture. We see sushi at every day in the supermarket, but what is beyond sushi? We hear dashi, ramen, izakaya, but what exactly are they? Japanese food is still a mystery for many people, and I try to demystify it in this program with my good guests. And my guest today is Jeremy Hunter, who is the founding director of the Executive Mind Leadership Institute at Peter F. Drucker Graduate School of Management. And it's long. And Jeremy teaches corporate executives how to examine their lives because he thinks that you cannot manage people without managing yourself first. And you may have heard of the concept of a flow state or being in the zone or Zen state, and his approach is based on them. And I got to know Jeremy through a very inspiring YouTube video hosted by the Japan Society's president and CEO Joshua Walker in New York. In that video, Jeremy explained how he conquered an incredibly challenging experience, it's really of survival physically, and which we are going to talk about, and how he uses his learning from the experience to empower others. But why Jeremy on Japan Eats? Because his mindset and the concept of flow are deeply related to Japanese culture. And he's half Japanese too. Also, his family runs a traditional food business in Japan. So today we'll discuss Jeremy's truly inspiring personal story that made him who he is now, the concept of a flow state, and Jeremy's 86-year-old father-in-law's legendary yakitori restaurant in Japan, and much, much more. But quickly, wait before we start, Japan Eats is available on the Heritage Radio Network website, as well as on iTunes, Stitcher, and Spotify as a podcast. So please go to iTunes, Stitcher, and Spotify and subscribe to Japan Eats. And please write a review. We really appreciate your feedback. Now, let's start a conversation with Jeremy Hunter. Hi, Jeremy. Welcome.
Hi, Akiko. Thank you.
Thank
It's
you.
wonderful to be here.
I'm excited to have you here. It was the first time I saw in the YouTube. I thought I really have to get on the show to share you with everybody who's listening to Japan Eats. So.
Well, I have to say, what your Japan Eats is such an amazing treasury of knowledge and wisdom. And I think you're now in the 200th episode or something like that. And it's so valuable to have this kind of knowledge so accessible to the world. So, what you're doing is a really wonderful thing. And I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you. And it means the world to me. Thank you, Jeremy. Really. Let's talk about your amazing life. So where are you from and what did you eat when you grew up?
Actually, I grew up in small town Ohio, Mansfield, Ohio, which is about halfway between Cleveland and Columbus. As you mentioned, my mother's Japanese. She was born in Manchuria, actually. And what did I eat growing up? Somehow my mother, after she married my father, mastered the canon of middle American food. And so, in thinking about this question, I remember distinctly this dish she would make, which was like a hamburger patty on top of mashed potatoes mixed with mashed carrots, all covered with this like Velveeta cheese sauce, flecked with green peas. And I thought, man, I haven't eaten that in maybe 45 years, and I'm making it for my son this week. So we would eat things like that, and then we would eat handmade gyoza with gyoza skin that she made herself, and so in between those range of things was what I ate growing up, and I have to say that our dinner table now is kind of this weird postmodern combination of things that seemingly don't really go together. You'll have like tonjiru, which is like a Japanese pork stew next to lasagna. And that's how we eat in this house. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
wow.
Yeah.
So that's the full range.
That's the full range.
Right. So, but it's interesting. So you were, and I also heard you are great grandson of a sumo wrestler. So
Right. My great-grandfather was indeed a sumo wrestler, which my mother didn't bother telling me about until I was like in my 40s. But he was a very gregarious fellow, from what I understand.
Well, shall I ask you a little more about him? He was like traveling up and down, traveling through the country, and it's probably a very high probability I have relatives who we don't know about. Awesome. Right. So my next book is your family history. That would be really wonderful. So, all right. So as I said at the beginning, I got to know you through the YouTube video made by Japan Society in New York, and also I watched your wonderful TED Talk about mindset and how to live your life to the fullest. And I'll put the link to the video on TED Talk on the show page. But so for listeners who have not seen them, could you tell us the very difficult experience?
I was 20 years old, and I went and got I was just finishing my second year of college, and there was a health fair on campus, and I thought, oh, what the heck? And so I got my blood pressure checked, and as I'm watching the nurse's face as she's looking at my blood pressure, I see her eyebrows go up, and I thought, oh God, when a nurse's eyebrows go up really fast, that's not a good sign. And in any case, 6 weeks later, I found myself at Cleveland Clinic being diagnosed with an autoimmune disease that is incurable, and at that point it was thought to be terminal. So the prognosis was 90% chance of mortality within 5 years, and even now the disease is not curable. And but for whatever reason, I can remember going with my father to the hospital, and we're walking out, and I looked at him and I said, Dad, I guess 90% is good news because somebody's got to be in the 10%. And I decided that was going to be me. And because science really didn't have an answer to this. In fact, the treatments were all worse than the disease. So I decided that maybe I could make it into a spiritual problem. And I had this very naive idea that, maybe if I meditated, a miracle would happen and I would keep on living. And I went back to school. I was an East Asian Studies major at a school named Wittenberg University, which is in Southern Ohio, which was very well known it had one of the first Asian Studies programs in America. And I went to talk with my professor, Eugene Swanger, who is taught for many years at the State Department and still my friend 30 years later. And he reached into his desk and he pulled out this book called The Three Pillars of Zen by Philip Kapleau, which was the first book in English to teach Westerners how to do Zen. And he said, here, read this and everything's going to be okay. And so I did. I read that book and it gave me, when I talk to American audiences, it's really important to know that, in Japan, Zen didn't come from California. And it was the warrior's practice. And I think that it was very attractive to the warrior class in medieval Japan because it helped train your mind to have this kind of intense focus in situations that were potentially mortal threats, right? Because you're fighting for a living. And I thought, as a 20-year-old, I thought this is useful, right? And I have to make my way in the world. And what it did was to give me the skill to be able to manage all the things that were happening in my mind. You're 20 years old and suddenly you're coming face to face with your mortality. And of course, there's going to be anger and rage and anxiety and all of that. And in the midst of that, you still have to make a life for yourself. And one of my axioms is that attention needs somewhere good to go. And, how you use your attention is really what your life becomes. And so it helped me to point my attention in kind of growth-oriented directions. And the thing is, a miracle did happen. And I ended up living another 17 years after that, actually. And but that was, I went on a whole journey of exploration of contemplative practices through Asia and the United States, and learned how to kind of work with all the stuff that was happening inside. And,
well, you said, that 90%, 10% thing, you said you decided to be in 10%. So that decision and intention led you to be in Zen, study Zen. So like the decision sounds like a very important first step.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. Years later, I had a student who had exactly the same disease, and but the thing was that he worked for an insurance company, and so he looked up the actuarial tables, right, which are all like the mortality rates. And I can remember sitting in my office, and he was shaking. He said, the mortality rate's 90%. And I said, yeah, that you have to see that as good news. And because somebody's got to be in the 10%. And, and unfortunately, I don't think he could make that move. And so it really is about, a lot of life is about how do you manage your fear, and which is something we never teach you how to do in school. And I think that understanding what fear is, and not trying to push it away, but also understand that you can learn how to work with it. And when you learn how to work with it, it can transform your life. Then you're not limited by your fear.
Interesting.
And that's a lot of what I do in my own work.
Right. Well, by the way, the fear, me personally, I have a lot of fear. And somebody said, all the good stuff is beyond fear. Like, whoa, so if you overcome all the fears, everything is good things is waiting for me. So that's like, I think most of us are fear-driven in the modern life. And it's important to remember that, I think.
Yeah, at some point, I think somebody should interview you, because you also have a very interesting life story. I offer to interview you for your own show one day, because I think your life story is really quite interesting as well. So
okay, so we turn the table and you're going to be the host. Okay.
Yes, yeah. I'm happy to be the guest host on Japan Heats one day.
Okay, let's do it.
Yes.
All right. So just so you are such an amazing, energetic person now. So what happened to turn, for direction of your life after the diagnosis?
Well, yeah. I ended up going to grad school to kind of study, what was the meaning of life. I mean, this is in retrospect, it was kind of a dumb decision, but I wanted to know what a good life was. And if I was only going to have a 5-year lifespan, then, I didn't really expect to live past 30, honestly. And so I thought, I'd go to school to understand what a good life is. In retrospect, I should have gone to Hawaii and learned how to surf and then, died on some big wave. But but anyway, I decided to go to the University of Chicago and do statistical analysis on people who were happy to find out the answer. But my advisor, which I guess we'll talk about a little bit later, was a man named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who was well known for developing the idea of flow theory. But he was also at that time one of the few American psychologists who were interested in what it meant to live a good life. And through that, I received a grant to study, and this is in the late 1990s, successful professionals who were also long-term mindfulness practitioners, which, mindfulness is another kind of Buddhist mental and emotional discipline to find freedom, basically, from your own mind. And in the late 1990s, to find successful professionals who were also long-term mindfulness practitioners was not very easy, because it wasn't so socially acceptable to say, hey, I'm a meditator, which, today is kind of hard to believe since it's kind of now hip. But one of the things that people told me, and I found people who were willing to, literally come out of the closet to talk about this. So the Fortune 500 CEOs and world famous architects and movie directors and all kinds of very interesting people, all people, incidentally, who use their mind to make a living in some way. I asked them, what do you think your life would be like if you didn't have this practice? And many of them said, oh, that's easy. I'd be dead. My life is being pulled in so many directions at once that if I didn't have this to keep me grounded, centered, and sane, I think I'd be dead. And then I'm listening to them thinking, oh yeah, you'd be dead too, Jeremy. And then we moved to the Drucker School, which you mentioned earlier, and Peter Drucker is considered to be the founding father of the discipline of management. And, he also had and he was also, as you know, a great fan of Japan, and he has an amazing collection of Japanese art, a lot of which was inspired by Zen. But he had this idea: you can't manage others unless you manage yourself first. But where do you ever learn how to manage that? And in this culture, education is all about what happens outside you, and there's nothing that we get that's really about how do you manage what happens inside you. And so I ended up offering to teach a class, and that class kind of exploded into my career. And in 2008, which was 17 years after my diagnosis, a friend of mine who's a physician was reading off the list of symptoms of kidney failure, and as he's going off the list, I'm checking off every one of these symptoms. And I thought, probably the game is up. I turned 5 years into 17 years, and maybe that's a pretty good run. And so I went back and chatted with my doctor. He said, you basically have three choices. You could go on dialysis. The mortality rate of dialysis patients in this country is 20% a year, which isn't a really great statistic. You could go on a list, right? In Los Angeles at that time, the list for a donor, a kidney to kind of pop up because some unfortunate person has a car accident or a motorcycle accident was 7 to 8 years. So if the mortality rate is 20% a year and you have to wait 8 years, the lines don't intersect really well and at the right time or place. And then the last choice is, well, you could ask people, which I thought, oh, good Lord, I'm an only child, so I do everything by myself. And so then I realized, I had to learn how to ask for help if I was going to live. And so I ended up writing a letter to basically everyone I knew and my students and all of that. And at the end of it, I sent that letter out in the beginning of 2008, and around May of 2008, the donor coordinator from Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Beverly Hills calls me and says, I'm calling to let you know that we're going to turn your donors away now. And I said, what are you talking about? And she goes, well, there's so many of them that we can't process donors for other patients. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Like what, just curious, like how many of them are there? And at that point, there were like something like 24 and 24 volunteers. And then the competitive part of me got on the telephone and ask, well, what's the record? And it turns out the old record was 7. So I thought, that's not bad. And 13 of those were my former students, including the person, Laura Newman, who became my donor, who's a kind of Amazon warrior of a woman.
Wow.
And so that's how that particular part of the story ends. But I will say that go ahead, please.
Well, that means that, it's donating kidney is not like donating your hair or something, right? It's like part of you. So you must have done something really special to
it was she's an amazing person, first of all. And for weeks afterwards, I had these unrelenting fantasies about Aston Martin V8 Vantages, and which I had never thought about ever before in my life outside of a James Bond movie. And she, rebuilds and races cars. And I called her and I said, I have these Aston Martin fantasies, and I think this is you. And she goes, oh, yeah, that's me. So it's an interesting life.
Right. Well, I'm so glad that happened. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people really are grateful that happened. All right, so I interrupted you, but but I think I should ask, so what exactly you teach at the Drucker School of Management?
Well, I think that I teach a class called The Executive Mind, and it's a way of really understanding how do you, I think that as professionals or, just as human beings, we have 2 games to play. There's a game, the outside game of having to be effective in the world and how to manage the forces kind of outside you, or at least deal with the forces outside you. And then how do you manage yourself? And how do you manage your own, emotional reactions, or your own attention, or your capacity to focus, or your own assumptions and expectations about things that unnecessarily limit you or reduce your choices. So what I think about what I do is I help people create choices for themselves in ways that they didn't realize they have. And it's all about creating a kind of internal freedom so that you can be more adaptive to whatever life throws at you. And of course, in this particular moment in history, with all of these things that are happening at this moment, pandemic and the race for social justice and all of this, climate change, all of that, we need to be more adaptive than ever. And so I've been quite busy this year.
Right. So the way to create freedom in someone's mind, so that's based on whatever the psychological state called flow. Is that what it is?
It starts with it. Flow, I think, is we probably all have experienced it. I think we know it maybe better by the phrase like being in the zone, where you're so absorbed into things, you kind of lose sense of yourself, or you lose sense of space and time, and you feel like you're being pushed to the limit. You feel truly alive. But in order to be able to get into that experience, you need to be able to focus your attention and to be able to concentrate. That's why I think rock climbers are, so adept at this, right? Because if they can't focus, they're going to die. And so there's nothing like mortality to focus your attention in a way. But you can structure it so that it happens in a lot more places. But that's really the essence of it. It's like, how do you use your attention, and what are you giving your attention to? And so in the flow process, in order to keep it going, you have to expand your ability, right? And expand your capacity to take on ever greater challenges. As your skills get better, you need a bigger challenge to take on in order to have that experience. And
Right.
so, and I think, we can talk about this in relationship to Japanese culture, but this is how we grow as a person, right? It's like you're always expanding your ability. And if we're doing it collectively, it's how do we grow as a culture?
Right.
So it's really essential,
Right, and especially nowadays, I think. But you said you need focus, but it's just a very human thing, right? Because it's not like fight or flight where you really get myopic about your choices are, but flow is almost the opposite.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a place where, you become so absorbed into something that, it can be exhilarating, right? It's for a lot of people, it's the most enlivened time of their life. It's the most engaged and energized time of their life. And so how do you bring that into more and more places in your life, so that more of your life is being used in a way that's meaningful or at least rewarding, even to the point of, using laundry folding, right? As a way of, you make a little game with yourself and how do you fold the laundry in a certain way? But I feel Japan is actually, as a culture, far more adept at doing this. But we can talk about that later. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you're going to talk about it now, I guess.
In terms of Japanese culture, I think. Yeah, I think that Japan is really like a flow society in some ways, at least traditionally, because you had this place that, we tend to think of Japan as a very rich place now, but that wasn't true for most of Japanese history, right? There are very few resources that people had to develop. And so, if the American mantra is more is better, and say like the Texas mantra is bigger is better, I think the Japanese mantra would be something like deeper is better. And how do you use the resources you have to their kind of utmost potential? Like look at origami, right? Folding paper, right? You take one sheet of paper and by using your imagination and your skill, you can make it into anything, right? To me, origami is so amazing. But there's this like cultural predisposition to use everything to its utmost. And because for a long time, there weren't a lot of things. And I think you can still find that in this culture, which is one of the reasons why I think so many of us are attracted to Japan and why, it's so beguiling in some way because the skill of things is being pushed to the nth degree, all the time.
Right. So I think that's interesting that you said Japan needed to accept what it is, because I think officially it's until 1972 or something, that's the economic number. Japan has been a poor country, and that was a turning point only later in the last century. So I think that the concept of Zen that you learned earlier sounds very much in common with the flow, because you kind of observe what you have and try to make the most of it internally. So is that the right way to think?
Yeah, I think that, well, there's also something there's a particular cultural value that I think Japanese have that is oriented around that values focused attention, which I think must have certainly come from Zen, right? And because in Zen, you're cultivating high states of concentration, right? Which is also, as you said, parallel to the flow experience. And so those high states of concentration are what drive this process of both, seeking enlightenment, but also, how do you engage with things to create these amazing things that they do, my close friend's little brother worked for many years for Toyota and was like bragging that they can like cast car parts within like 2 or 3 microns, that they can measure that, I mean, who else does that? So I don't know if it's useful to be able to do that, but they can do that, right? So in our culture, in Western culture, we train thinking. Thinking is the starting point of our education, right? I think, therefore I am, said Descartes. But in Japan, it was different. And other Asian countries, it was different. The starting place for education was to cultivate focused attention. And And that's a very different way to educate a person. So you have all of these things, like tea ceremony and archery and flower arrangement, calligraphy, right? They're all there. And when my father was in Japan in the 60s, people weren't considered fully developed until they had mastered one of these arts. He was a teacher, and all of his students, he said, could do something like that. And
right.
then that creates a kind of stability and focus in a person that is an extraordinarily wonderful quality.
Right. So that's the, something do, like sado or judo or kendo. Those is the way of something, and it doesn't end, because until you die, you have to keep studying, and there's no end.
It's infinite.
Right. Even if after you die, it is still there, and you have to maybe when you next to your life, not life after this life, you probably continue pursuing it.
Keep going. Yes.
Yeah. So, anyway, this is a related question, but in the Japan side video, you said unexamined life is not worth living.
And the unexamined life, yeah.
Yeah, that made me think. So could you elaborate on it?
Yeah, of course, that was by the famous Japanese philosopher Socrates. And I think that gets on something else that you touch upon, which is the unexamined life basically is because we're mindless most of the time. And, why do we need to train attention? It's because most of the time we're living on autopilot and we just kind of go through the motions. And so cultivating attention to be able to actually look at yourself is a way to hedge against mindlessness. And I can see, in some of my students who are older, who've been, in some ways very successful by how we measure success in this society. They ended up with a life that they thought would be great, but it actually turned out not to be that great. And then because they kind of went on autopilot. And, one of my students who was the CIO of a multi-billion-dollar food company said, I'm in my 50s now, and I look around and I look at my life, and I said, this isn't actually the one I wanted. And yet, he's not broke. But he said, I really wanted to be a pilot. And when I was in my 20s, and yet I got rewarded for doing computers. And I just kept following that, not really thinking about, is this what I wanted? But one thing led to another. And now, 20 years have passed, 25 years have passed. And I look at my life and I'm kind of disappointed in myself.
Mm-hmm. So listeners who have not examined your life, probably including myself, let's think about it. Unexamined life is not worth living. That is so true.
What do you want? I don't think that's true of you, but what do you want really? And which is a terrifying question to ask in some way. But I have to say that, the gift of mortality, gift of knowing that you're going to die forces you to ask yourself this question. Like, okay, I know that the clock is ticking. And so what am I going to do? And again, it's all about what are you going to put your attention on?
Right. So you went to the boot camp to train that mindset from 20 years old, I think, or 17 years.
That was the gift, of that experience, for sure.
So how do you get into the flow mode by yourself?
Well, so it's not that hard, I think. One is that you have to decide some goal. So let's use folding T-shirts, okay? So, you make a little game of it. And is the collar going to be inside or outside? Are you going to fold it in quarters or thirds? And you have to be able to focus, right? So you can't be interrupted. You have to have some sense of, are you following the rules you set out for yourself? And then just do that. It's like, you become much more interactive with your world. So I do this with chicken thighs, actually, because this is a food-oriented household. So I think I have, at least in my mind, perfected the art of the grilled chicken thigh, and it has to do actually with one of the videos I saw on the Chores website, which was about the Japanese sponsor, yes, and how do you. I buy a whole chicken leg from Whole Foods for $3.99 a pound, and that on the Chores website, there's a way of cutting the chicken leg so that, in basically 3 cuts, you debone the chicken leg, and it is extraordinarily elegant. And then, so I do that, and then it goes into 4 days of shiokoji marination, and then after 4 days, I heat up a yanagi sori grill pan, and 3 minutes on one side, 2 minutes on the other, and that gives you the perfect grilled chicken thigh. That is my weekly flow activity.
Oh, wow.
And but if you can learn how to debone a chicken thigh in basically four cuts, that is an extremely. I'll buy like way more chicken thighs than we actually need. My wife gets irritated, but just so that I can like cut the chicken thigh up, right? So it's really fun.
Wow. So now I see you're in charge of laundry in your house, and once a week you definitely cook chicken. But
I'm the cook of the family, yeah.
Right. Wow. But it's really interesting, right? How that sounds like a daily chore can turn to be something very mindful. It's your choice. Yeah, your decision.
Absolutely. The same is true of mopping.
Right.
So like daily. So with my students, I talk about because we're living in Los Angeles, right? And so Las Vegas is a short drive away. Like your life doesn't. And so a lot of my students go to Las Vegas for the weekend. And I said, stop waiting for Vegas, right? Your life. So what are you doing? If you're going out there on Thursday, what are you doing? Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, right? Does that or your life still counts then? Right. And so how do you make all of your life interesting and useful, not just the parts where you're having, exciting things happen? And so I think so don't wait for Vegas, right? Just use right now. What can you do? What can you do to make things interesting?
Right. Yeah. And also I heard you like tea ceremony, which is highly ritualistic. So why do you like tea ceremony, and why the rituals important to be in flow mode?
Yeah, I think that's another great example of how Japanese culture really refined this process. And, as there are like a gazillion rules about how to do tea ceremony, properly. You turn the bowl a certain way and you whisk it a certain way. And if you kind of step back from that and look at it, you can see they're all just rules to focus attention. And when I think if you have a very good tea teacher, that teacher understands it's really about losing individual awareness, right? That you and the tea ceremony, I think, carried to its ultimate form is that there's this dropping of separate consciousness between the host and the guest, and they become one, right? And that's, of course, one of the hallmarks of the flow experience is that your individual consciousness goes away. And I think that's one of the amazing things about it. But I think it's easy to get lost in the rules, and then it becomes this kind of boring rote exercise. And the danger is always mindlessness, so you just blindly follow the rules as opposed to really closely pay attention to what's actually happening and or actively pay attention to what's really happening. So tea ceremony is a beautiful way of practicing in some way. Daily life is so. I made up my own because things just got too busy. But I generally tend to drink matcha every morning, partially because it's good for you, and it also helps you focus attention and all of that. But our freezer is stuffed full of like 20 different varieties of matcha I collected all over. And if you want a suggestion, I got one. But
Oh, please.
So I just, Irokuen, which is a small maker in Kyoto, makes a fantastic matcha called Ichigo Ichie. I don't even know if it's available in this country, but it's great. It's 1,600 yen, and it's one of the best tasting matchas I've ever had.
Wow.
So so I just made these little rules, like where do I put the hot water? Where do how do you hold the bowl? Anybody can do it, right? So, and that's my little morning ritual.
Even I think, listeners may not have the matcha, all those equipment, but even making a cup of coffee, grinding coffee to make a perfect cup of coffee, that could be the way to
absolutely.
Get into
and I'm sure, we all know somebody who's a coffee maniac, and that's including me. Next to the matcha, there's 20 bags of different coffee I collected around the world. But any process like that. But I'm sure a diehard coffee person is experiencing some kind of flow when they're making their coffee.
Right. So listeners, let's find any daily activity to go into flow mode. I will try to find one too. Yeah. All right. So now let's take a quick break here, and when we come back, we'll discuss how Jeremy is inspired by the philosophy of his father-in-law, who has been making yakitori for decades. So please stay with us.
This episode is brought to you by Brooklyn Ball Factory, a Japanese eatery and coffee shop at 95 Montrose Avenue in East Williamsburg. Brooklyn Ball Factory uses the best ingredients to make Japanese comfort food, like their bento boxes featuring meatballs, grilled veggies, Japanese fried chicken, or pork shabu-shabu. Plus, visit Brooklyn Ball Factory's sister restaurants, Momo Sushi Shack, Samurai Papa, Samurai Mama, Bozu, and Gitare Shokudo. Learn more at brooklynballfactory.com.
Welcome back. You're listening to Japan Eats. I'm your host, Akiko Katayama, and my guest today is Jeremy Hunter, who is the founding director of the Executive Mind Leadership Institute at Peter Drucker Graduate School of Management. And he has deep connections with Japan, spiritually, emotionally, and biologically. So let's talk about your favorite topic, which I think is food.
Yes.
Even beyond flow. So I heard that your wife is from Yamanashi Prefecture, and her father is a chef, the chef owner of the legendary yakitori restaurant. I've forgotten the name, sorry. But
Torigen.
Torigen. Yeah. So he still cooks at the age of 86. And for listeners who are not familiar with the yakitori, it's grilled chicken on skewers, but it takes a lot of craftsmanship to make a great one. So what is his philosophy of yakitori?
Well, one day he says to me, his outward appearance is very tough. And he says, but inside he's nothing but a teddy bear. And he does this. He also has mastered another art. He does this very refined kind of calligraphy, which is very rare to do. It's not Chinese. They aren't Chinese characters, but a rather indigenous Japanese script. And he's also a shodo. Yeah.
Right.
And he's quite skilled at it. And so in any case, one day he says to me, he says, so how many yakitoris do you think I make in a year? And I thought, I don't know, like thousands, right? Thousands. And then he nods his head, yes. And then he's quiet and he stares at me and he goes, how many do you think are perfect? And I thought, okay, my father-in-law is asking me how many of the things he makes every day for the last 51 years are perfect. I'm not going to answer this question. So I just play dumb. I said, no, I don't know how many are perfect. And then he's quiet, this dramatic pause. And then he holds up 5 fingers. He goes, that's how many. And and so, of course, he's been doing it for 51 years every day, and he only makes 5 perfect ones. He's since downwardly revised his estimate of how many perfect ones he makes to one a year.
So 51 before so far. Oh my God.
But the shop is called Torigen, and it's in the north exit of Kofu Station, and it's kind of anybody who grew up in Kofu probably has eaten at my father-in-law's restaurant. Wow. But in any case, I thought, so here is this man, right, who even after 51 years says, okay, I only get, out of the thousands I make, I only get perfect one 5 times. And the other day we were having some work done on our house, and our contractor had a new apprentice. And I asked him, so what do you do? Or like, why do you want to become a contractor? Because I think being a contractor is like one of the greatest jobs in the world, but it will never be outsourced and you'll never be replaced by a robot. And it's, I think, a lot of fun. But I said, so like, why do you want to do this? And it turns out he works at a Subway shop, right? So, and he says, he goes, I'm sick and tired of making sandwiches every day. I'm making the same sandwich every day. And at that moment, I remembered my father-in-law. I said, here's my father-in-law making exactly the same yakitori skewer every day for 51 years. And he would never say like, I'm sick of it. And like, what's the difference? And I realized, that part of it is that he whether it's conscious or not, or whether he consciously did this or not, but I think this is also something that's particularly Japanese. It's not, I don't say it's uniquely Japanese, but it is particularly Japanese. But he's using this process of making these yakitori as a kind of meditation. You know, they're his way of refining himself. And I called him one day and I said, so I have this theory, you know, like, how do you know when you're making a good yakitori, right? And he said, he said something about the color and the scent and the charcoal and all of that. And then he was quiet and he said, well, I know it's going to be good when my mind and my heart are unified. My mind, heart, and my body are unified. Which I thought, okay, so you really are using this as a kind of meditation practice. And I said, and then he said, yes, you figured me out.
Wow.
And he said, yeah.
So he is in the flow mode, right?
Yeah,
when he's
absolutely.
Making yakitori. Wow.
Absolutely. And I think that is something that is not uncommon amongst those kind of Japanese shokunin, those craftspeople, because and I think that's part of the interesting cultural heritage of Japan, is that focused attention is their superpower. And I think it's a way of, it's a kind of spiritual development that you find. You find these people like my father-in-law all over, whether they're making knives or lacquerware or something like that. But anybody who's ever encountered somebody like that, they have a kind of quality of wisdom or a quality of knowing, that I think comes from this repetitive engagement with this thing. You're setting this frame and then they're performing within that frame. He told me that I didn't think I started to get good at this until 15 years into it. Then I started to realize, and I started to see results that I hadn't seen before. And then he went on to say, how he didn't trust people who did so many different things, which is me. But I don't know if he realized that's me because I do so many different things. But anyway, he talked about the virtue of like sticking with one thing and like mastering it and going super deep into it, which I think is also a certain kind of Japanese proclivity, but maybe that's true for traditional cultures everywhere. But that stamina, creates a level of skill and subtlety that I think is one way which gives Japan its interesting, unique flavor. And in fact, I started to think about, Japan as being until COVID, right? That Japan's tourism rate was really off the charts, to the point, where it was creating social problems, and that there were so many tourists in the country. And, when I was going through college, that certainly wasn't true. And I thought, why is it now that Japan is so attractive to people? And I think part of it is that there's still this very strong commitment to analog culture, which is unique, and it has its own downsides. But there still is this very vibrant analog quality. And as the world increasingly becomes more and more digital, right? Like things that you can touch, things that you involve your body, right? Things that engage all your senses, which Japan is so refined. Japan has this capacity to create these ethereal, highly refined material experiences, that there's something that brings you back into your body. Like I tell my Japanese friends, look, you can't digitize a bathtub, right? You can't make the hot springs experience a digital one, right? And because it's your naked body in this hot water. And so there's something about quality of life and quality of experience that I think Japan can offer the world, that it has this potential of creating a kind of hybrid culture. Like how do we merge the digital with the analog in a way that's humane and that reminds us we're living in a body. We have to take care of our body, that we can't always just be off in these disembodied digital realms. And I'm a fan of all of that stuff too. So I don't want to sound like some Luddite, but at the same time, the physical reality is that we need to eat, we need to take care of ourselves, we need to live in the physical world as well. And I think that's something, the inherent nature of, well, I would say the kind of quietly obsessive nature of how Japanese culture produces beauty in so many different realms of daily life, down to your kid's lunchbox, which is a kind of competition between moms in some way, right? Who can make the most elaborate lunchbox. But the creation of beauty in nearly every facet of daily life is something that's really precious, and something I think that more and more of us recognize, either consciously or unconsciously. Oh, we need that. We need that.
Yeah. So the more examples I hear from you, I think it goes back to what you said: attention to this present moment, and you want to. It's impossible to perfect it, but it's the mindset. You want to perfect it to have the most enriched experience in this moment. So that's kind of, I think, the flow related and Zen mindset maybe. And, it's just a beautiful thing. So.
Yeah, I think, Japan defines quality of life in moments. And so, for example, right, like the heated toilet seat, right? The moment, like anytime you put your body, your special body parts on a cold toilet seat, right? It's very unpleasant. And so, of course, the Japanese invent a heated toilet seat, right? So like, oh, that moment is so glorious, right? But it's, and there are like 1,000 of those moments as you go through your day in Japanese life, that quality of life is defined in moments. I can remember buying some yogurt at the convenience store, and then on the yogurt packaging it says, "Oh, we've designed a special package to make sure the yogurt doesn't stick at the top of the film that covers the yogurt can," right? So like I think everybody has had the experience of opening yogurt and seeing the yogurt stuck on the bottom of the film that seals the yogurt container. You think, okay, how do I get that off, right? Somebody in Japan eliminated that moment, right? So you don't have to do it. And that's so, that's what's so charming about it. And, there are all kinds of those moments, so that even though you're living in this tiny little cramped house or in this really busy city, you're also at the same time encountering these moments as you go through your day that make it a little more palatable in some way.
Right. Oh, that's perfect. All right. So I wish we had 2 more hours, but yeah, we need to wrap up. So what's your plan? Like, what are your plans right now?
Well, I think I'm doing a couple new things. So one, I'll be on the faculty of the Inner MBA program created by Sounds True, which is something new starting this year. So I think if you just Google Inner MBA, that's happening. And for myself, I decided that because I got good at living with uncertainty and crisis for 17 years. Living from day to day, not knowing if today was going to be my last day. And so I think I've kind of developed a unique capacity to help people use crisis as a growth experience. And so I developed a webinar called The Storm Makes You Stronger. And if you Google that, I'm sure you can find it. There's actually a version of that I did for the Japan Society, where I was also experiencing severe caffeine withdrawal. So I think I was incoherent most of the time. But anyway, creating an interview series, and that crisis brings about an opportunity to reconsider and reflect on your life in a way that, quote unquote, normal times don't. And so I've started a video series that will be on YouTube, like examining, what are the real big picture questions? Like, how do you deal with death and grief and dying? How do you deal with money? Like, what is the nature of love, right? What is the nature of pain? And how do you use that as a growth experience? So like all the big issues of life, we're going to explore. I have the first one finished already. So,
yeah. So send me the link, and also where can we find your updates? Then I will put them all on the show page.
Oh, sure. And then in Japan, let's see, we have, I have my own firm that I operate in Japan. That is a organization called Transform, and we have regular online programs there. The website is transform-your-world.com. And so we'll have some programs coming up, actually. So, and then, of course, the Drucker School, I'm there every semester.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Great. And I think you have a jeremyhunter.net.
And, yes, jeremyhunter.net. Yes.
Okay. Right. So we have, I had more questions, but I couldn't finish. So maybe hopefully in the future we can do it again. But thank you for joining us today, Jeremy.
Oh, it was my sincere pleasure, Akiko. Thank you.
Thank you. So listeners, if you have any questions or comments about the show or suggestions for show topics or guests, please contact us at japaneats@heritageradionetwork.org or akikokatayama.com. Japan Eats is a weekly program and always available at heritageradionetwork.org, as well as on iTunes, Stitcher, and Spotify as a podcast. Our engineer today is Amanda Wang, and we'll take a summer break for the rest of the August. So we'll see you in September, and thank you for listening. I'll see you in a few weeks.
Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast. Give us a review and tell us your thoughts. The best thing you can do is share this with someone who would find it interesting and helpful. If you have an idea for other topics you'd like to explore, please let us know. Contact me at info@jeremyhunter.net. Thank you to the multi-talented Mr. Jason Beck for making the magic happen behind the scenes. And our music is the creation of Jeffrey with a G Munger. You can learn more about his work at kettleblackmusic.com.